Right, okay, I'd now like to welcome Chief Constable Amanda Pearson and Superintendent Stu Gates to talk about enhanced video response. This is another game-changing intervention, I think, that is genuinely transformational for policing, probably in the UK and definitely abroad. Thank you, both of you.
Do you want to take a seat? I'm conscious about not standing behind that screen where you won't see me at all. But, right, good morning. So you don't need a picture of me because you can see me in front of you. But this morning we intend to give you an overview of the randomised controlled trial that we ran in Dorset last year, led by Stu, in partnership with Cambridge, known as Enhanced Video Response, and how we're developing this further with the College of Policing to support other forces. So the information in the presentation is a little bit about the process, kind of how we ran the trial, the governance and the improvements that we've realised through offering this alternative response using video conferencing at the initial point of contact with those victims and witnesses. So our trial was intended to build on the previous research that some of you may have heard about that was led by Kent in conjunction with Cambridge, which was RVR, which was focused particularly on domestic violence. So why did we go on this journey in Dorset? Well, I came to Dorset Police in March last year as the Chief Constable, so I wouldn't probably endorse Simon's recommendation of not speaking to your Chief about randomised controlled trials. Sometimes you'll find that they're quite accommodating and quite supportive in that. But I came into Dorset Police last year. I found a good force, it's got good foundations, with really good people who were striving to deliver a good service to victims. But there were things getting in the way of that. That was great for me as a Chief Constable because I could see that our staff, our officers and our volunteers were really motivated, but we really had to get underneath what's getting in the way of them delivering an even better service. So in Dorset, we have quite a number of students who've been through the Master's programme and people who are interested in evidence-based policing. And we do try to use that evidence-based approach when we're looking at how we can unblock those things that are getting in the way of our officers and staff delivering a better service. Our force vision, probably similar to many of you in the room, is quite simple. It's a safe county for everyone. And for everyone in Dorset, that might be slightly different to everyone in some other forces. That means the people that live there, the people that work there, but also the millions of people that visit there. And maintaining the legitimacy of the public in Dorset is really key to get that trust and confidence right with all of those communities. And it's not equal across all of our communities, as I'm sure it isn't in other forces. So we have to work harder with some to build that trust and confidence. We are, as many are, committed to delivering quality and timely response to the public and ensuring that all of our frontline staff are focused on a preventative and investigative mindset to reduce harm, reduce crime and antisocial behaviour, but in ways that the public want and ways that the public would expect. And technological advances have given us all in policing an opportunity to evolve and be agile with that service delivery. So, let's tell you a little bit about Dorset. Doesn't it look nice? It is nice. And it is a destination of choice for the UK. There are vast areas of outstanding natural beauty, beaches stretching 88 miles, 139 sites of special scientific interest. It's rural, coastal and urban centres, with actually about 46% of our population living in those rural communities, where we know that the fear of crime can actually be higher than the incidence of crime because of that isolation. There's no motorways in Dorset. There are 3 major trunk roads, which you can spend a lot of time on in the summer. And we do have an airport. We have Bournemouth Football Stadium, depending on how well they're doing, depends on the challenge that creates in terms of policing. And we have a seaport in Poole. The population is just under 800,000, but it is an ageing population. The average age is about 52. But we do have a large number of language schools, universities and colleges, which massively inflates that population, but also means that we have a growing diversity of the population in Dorset. One of the things you may have noticed on that slide, I talked about the population and being a safe county for everyone. That includes 25 million day visits per year. That's a huge number of additional people coming into Dorset. And we talk about the summer, but it really now extends from May to September, which massively increases the demand into a small force. So I could talk a little bit about demand, just to give you a context for the trial. So you'll see on here just sort of the highlights of typical demands on an average day. And for some, that will be tiny compared to what they do in their force. For others, that's huge, but it's all relative. We would expect to get about 400 999 calls a day, probably record 140 crimes, and around 24, 25 arrests. But those are averages, so they do not take into account that peak summer demand when those numbers are significantly higher and the demands and the incidents and the queues that we have are significantly higher. The demand, when we looked at the demand for 12 months prior to our trial, we received, this was 2022, we received around 370,000 contacts via phone or email. Created 175,000 records for those, which required some sort of resource deployment. These are risk assessed, and for those of you, and I don't think we've still got it completely consistent even across UK policing, but we have 6 categories of that risk assessment, with grade 3 being our largest pool of incidents for grade 3. So grade 3 basically means it's not immediate, it's not life-threatening, we don't need to go there now and then, it's not urgent, but it's still important, and there could still be some level of risk there. It might be something that's historical, but there are still serious offences. This was also the cohort of calls that we were struggling to provide a service to victims and witnesses the most. Victims are waiting far too long for that service that they rightly expected. We looked across the county local policing area, which is the most rural of our policing areas, and that delay was exacerbated because of the geography. Out of the above samples, so out of those contacts, those grade 3s were around 40% of that demand. And the average time from opening that and closing that call for grade 3 was around 67 hours for the county local policing area. And that didn't include actually resolving the problem. That's just opening and closing the log. Sometimes those incidents would sit on sergeants' inboxes or in other workflows for up to 3 weeks until somebody got round to them. So our randomised control trial was focused on the county LPA to test the effects of a virtual response in our most rural areas, deliver a timely and victim-focused service at the right time and in the right way for the victim. Now, it's not just me as chief saying we needed to do better. I'll just skip through this because you'll want to hear from Stu as to how he ran the trial and the results. But actually, it was highlighted in our HMIC inspection. The last one was in 2022, which said that we needed to improve that level of response and the standard of our investigations, which were intrinsically linked. We know that other forces have seen the same thing. In this round of inspections, I think now we're still only at the point where one force has been graded good for responding to the public and for investigations. So it's still a challenge for UK policing. So our randomised control trial specifically focused on that grade 3 cohort of calls in the county LPA, testing whether an agile, innovative and more timely response would have a different effect. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Stu, who's going to talk through how he ran the trial and the results that we saw through that. Thank you, Stu.
Thank you. I like to put this picture up every now and then just to remind myself that of my time here at Cambridge. So just to reassure everybody, I've got Cambridge ties, so I do know what I'm talking about. But when we start getting into statistically significant findings, Barack's over on the right-hand side. He can answer any of the questions because he was my supervisor on this. So I'm just going to explain a little bit around, as my chief said, some of the findings we had with the randomisation of a virtual offering. And I'll just talk a little bit about the process in which we ran in Dorset to make sure it was robust. But first, Just want to give a bit of an overview of how many officers, time, etc. we spent. So we ran the trial for 3 months, and you can see here within that 3 months there was actually, because we had one team of 10 police officers, 2 sergeants. They conducted 366 shifts in totality within the 3 months. And you just compare that to our business as usual, which was obviously going to be so we've got our treatment and our control sample. We didn't take any police officers from the front line to make sure that we didn't kind of make any adverse effects on our results. You can see there that on average, at any given time, you will have, within that county LPA, as my chief just said, you'll have 19 police officers on duty in that area. So that's responding to the grade 1 to 3s, and that's earlies, lates, and nights. For our virtual officers, as I said, we had 10 police officers, but as we know, everybody comes with annual leave, abstractions, sickness. We averaged 6.4 officers on when they were on duty. So they would work 5 shifts, have 4 off, and then they would come back on so we'd do earlies and lates, depending on the demand review from the year before. So total hours worked, just up on there. And the reason I'm telling you this is just to show that we had 1,059 cases that went through our trial in the 3 months. And obviously some of those are treatment and control. We had a 60-40 split. But what we realised within the trial is actually for those 6.4 officers, when they were on duty, the demand that was coming through, we could have still taken another 9% of that demand with those 6.4 officers. Just everybody talks around randomised controlled trials, but we always need to look at the evidence, don't we, to say actually how comparable are the treatment and control. Barack and I had many. He's probably still not talking to me. He's blocked me on any WhatsApp or text message. But we're really reassured when the results started coming in around the call types and actually the equal split across the two. So what is the EVR process? Obviously, the slides will be made available, you can look at the detail in your own time. But I just wanted to put these slides up just to give some reassurance around covering something that my chief just said around it being victim-led. But also, one of the promises that I made throughout this was that we would ensure that we weren't putting victims or callers at greater risk. And you can see here that we had various layers of kind of oversight and grip to make sure that the calls that were being put through to a virtual team were continuously reviewed, rethrived, to make sure that it was safe and obviously appropriate for the victim to have it. So we trained 240 call takers face to face, and we had automations in the storm systems. We had, it sounds really grand, I said this at Copenhagen when we went there, we had a 24-hour helpline for 3 months where officers could call, and they did, at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. But that was just my mobile number. But it does sound good if you could say we put a helpline on. But yeah, that was just my phone. And then it switches over to the EVR team where the sergeants would hold responsibility for that call and making sure we get to that victim. So I'll just whistle through this. As I said, we ran one team, so clearly there were times where the team were not on duty. So we measured the sub-analysis groups. So first is when the team are on duty, how quickly we're getting to them, what the results are. The second is single online home. We had a real big backlog when we started this trial. It was one of the things that my executive wanted us to look at trying to reduce those. We had about a 14-day backlog. And the third is, inevitably, the calls that would come in when the virtual officers are not on duty, but they end up picking it up when they come on duty after their days off or earlies into lates. So what we're measuring here, and my chief said around some of the data at the beginning, that was from the 60-odd hours, was from a CAD record or a record being opened to the point of being closed. what we wanted to do is we wanted to measure actually what service are we giving to victims. So here we have measured from the point the victim calls the police, emails the police, to when the officer is conducting an investigation with that individual, not phoning them and making an appointment, not, sorry, we can't make it today. It's sitting in front of them, be it virtually or in person, and conducting that investigation. And here you can see sub-analysis 1, when the virtual officers were on duty and the calls were switched through to them when they were on, average response time over the 3 months was 1 hour 25 minutes. That compares to over 210 or 211 hours for business as usual. As you move down the subgroups, at the bottom here is, so we also measured the calls. My chief said around some calls going to sergeants' inboxes and individual officers' inboxes. We've measured every single one of those, all 1,059. And if you put them all together, on average, a virtual response is 19 days faster for a victim to have that initial investigation. So we've done the analysis to work out what times we were going to work the shift pattern. And here you can see the 22-23, we completed our trial the 8th of October. The previous year, you can see here, in that county local policing area, how many victims at 0600 hours fortnightly were waiting for police to turn up, or for a further call to kind of make further arrangements because we haven't kept to our promise previously. So if we overlay that now with 23-24, so you can see here, 9th is obviously the first point of data collection. That 107, a lot of those are control sample, which we couldn't touch because we needed to wait and see what the outcomes were. But as we go across, you can see here, when I think my chief will talk about it in a moment, when the results were presented and we decided we were going to go to earlies and lates 7 days a week. You can see here consistently we've seen a reduction of victims that are still waiting to be seen. Now some would ask, 1st of January, why is the peak? For about 3 days, because obviously we didn't know what was going to happen with the trial, what the results were going to be, if it was going to be a failure and my chief officer was going to go, right, everybody back to business as usual. We hadn't planned officers to be on a bank holiday on New Year's Day. And you can see the impact of not having that team there rating has on your outstanding demand. But more importantly, how long victims are waiting. Brack, you might recognise some of these. So some of the other things we were measuring. So we looked at within the UK Code 16. So victims not supporting a prosecution or investigation. We measured that on the business usual versus the enhanced video response. You can see there was a reduction of the use of Code 16. We had an independent performance team, if you like, so it was an inspector and a sergeant who weren't linked to the trial that went through every single case, and 75% of the victims within the virtual cases were supportive of further police involvement, so prosecution versus 45%. And then just a couple of the others, the positive outcome rate was actually, I would say, again, I'm looking at you, Barack, this is why we don't talk very much anymore. I would say it's 5.2%. Barack would say it's 4.9% because we had a couple of failure cases spill over because of the offender return, so I wasn't allowed to incorporate those. He's a stickler for data. And then the arrests were much higher. But one of the things when I started, and we talked a little bit about getting the buy-in from the workforce and kind of the getting your senior leaders on board. One of the things that we looked at was how much work was coming out of the virtual team into further patrol teams, and actually 72.7% was dealt with in its entirety at the initial point of contact. So statements were taken, safeguarding referrals were done, etc. Now, investigative standards, because this is one of the things that we were really targeting, one, because of our HMIC, but more importantly, because we were letting victims down, not investigating crime properly. I mean, there is a caveat here that the virtual team obviously knew that we were running a trial, so they were probably working a little bit harder at making sure they got everything they needed to get to the primary investigation. But it was 96.8% compliance with College of Policing guidelines. I'll just finish on a couple of bits around some feedback, and then I think the Chief's going to come back up about the so what next. We done randomised surveys with victims, and I picked out a couple. There were 23 questions in the survey, and you can see there how many we actually completed. But here I've just wanted to put up around how satisfied our victims were with that virtual offering. So if they were offered it at the beginning of the time they contacted police and we followed through with that, what would that impact have on victim satisfaction? And you can see here the rate in which we met victims' expectations was much higher in virtual. The virtual is obviously the red, and the business usual the blue. The speed of response, 78% of the victims that we surveyed were satisfied with the speed of the response versus 24% for business as usual. The initial officer who dealt with your call, 81% of victims who had a virtual response said they were satisfied with how the initial officer investigated their crime versus 46% for business as usual. And then we asked all of those victims who had a virtual response, what did they think and would they do it? Would they have it again? 89% said they would, and they would recommend it to a family or friend. So when I send the slides, I was hoping to show a video at the beginning, but we can't access the internet. But we've had a bit of interest from the media, and they've been in and interviewed some of our victims that have had a virtual response, and some of it's quite powerful around what they say about being given the power back to what happens to them as a victim of crime. But here I've just picked out a couple. I mean, we had over 100 free text comments. But there's just a couple here from victims. One of the things I don't think we really appreciated was, and I'll ask my chief to comment on this bit, is the impact it had on our frontline police officers. Don't get me wrong, it was a lot of work to get buy-in from across the force. I mean, I like attending a briefing, but I've never sat on so many briefings and had so many things fired at me. But actually, at the end, the support from our frontline staff was overwhelming, and so much so that they demanded to see the chief officers to ask us to carry on with our virtual team. And then I think I'm just going to ask the chief to come up about next steps. So there is a plan. It wasn't my plan, but I'll leave that to the chief to explain, and then I'll take any questions. Do you want me to do your clicker for you?
I think yes. We can put them all up. That's fine. Yeah, thank you. Oh, you've gone one ahead now.
Yeah, it was on this one.
All right, thank you. So, Stu has kind of undersold all of the work that he put into that and the results that we got. And if we had a lot longer, and we did an hour and a half session, didn't we, not long ago on Teams for forces who were interested. So there's quite a lot of detail to get into. But the results, as you can see, are really positive. And this is the bit about perhaps sometimes you do want to speak to the chief about the trial you're doing, if it's something you then are thinking that you might be able to scale up and embed across the force. So the next step for us was actually looking at the evidence-based results and the outcomes that Stu had achieved, is making a decision to say we need to roll that out across the force. So we've got two slightly different policing areas. So county was very geographic, very rural, some market towns. Rolled it out in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, a lot more urban area, more demand. Rolled out the same model, or so we thought. So one of the lessons in this, I think we were talking about the scaling up piece, is that we said, well, in that case, as a chief, I want this rolled out. I want it to cover a greater span of time. So I want it to be from 8 in the morning till 10 in the evening to reduce the demand on the front line and to provide that better service to the victims. What we did discover was that actually when it went into the second area, locally, people decided to run it slightly differently. And it doesn't matter how much you tell someone, we've done this, we've done it with Cambridge, it's been evaluated, here's how you do it, people will still make tweaks. And of course, the context of policing might be slightly different, but there's a lesson learned from us in there in that actually we didn't see as much of an impact as we had done in the county. We were able to very quickly, because we're monitoring all the time the metrics with this and the impact, very quickly go in and rectify that. And as a result of that, have worked with the college to make sure we've got a really thorough blueprint that says, here's the model and here's the blueprint for implementing it based on the RCT that we've run and the evidence base that says what works. If you decide to depart from that, then all we can say is you won't necessarily see the same results that you have seen in the trial. But that's part of the challenge of evidence-based policing, isn't it, and scaling it up. So we have rolled it out. We have embedded it into our new operating model. We have linked it in with contact and what we do with immediate resolution. But I want to be really clear. Two things really clear from me as a chief. One is it's not contact, it's response. It's virtual response. Those officers that Stu talked about, the job satisfaction they had, were response officers who, for one reason or another, were no longer able to go out and physically patrol. But they were able to use their response experience and skills. And some of them very tearfully told me it was the first time they felt like response officers again, because they were being a virtual response officer. It's not contact, it's response. And the second thing is it's a choice. It has to be a choice for the public. It's not something we're not saying to the public, it's going to take us too long to drive up there. You've got to have a virtual appointment. We are offering it as a choice. So it is now part of our operating model. It does mean I've got to hold my nerve a bit, because we've had to invest in putting staff into that front end of the process with the knock-on impact that it's going to have on the reduction of demand for those who are out on the front line. But it does mean we've got to hold our nerve on it a little bit. We've created the blueprint, as I mentioned, and a readiness assessment. So for those forces that we're working with, and we're working very closely with forces in the southwest to roll it out at the moment, we've got a readiness assessment for the force to say, how ready are you to implement this? And then to look at the blueprint. And as I mentioned, we've now got support from the college. Steve Line, who couldn't be here today, but is one of my ACCs, is now the SRO working with the college to roll this out across England and Wales for forces that are interested. And that is pretty much where we are, other than a bit of a teaser in terms of next steps. My next opportunity to look at this is about the opportunities of the technology. And actually, we think the technology that we use Good Sam, you could use something else, could be put into the hands of our other investigators, to not necessarily response officers, and they could use that as a more effective and efficient way of dealing with victims and witnesses. And that's where we're going next. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's a lot of people here from Police and Crime Commissioners' offices. Real challenge here. I think 33 out of 43 forces have already got RVR. As you can see, it's transformational. We don't have time for questions, but please grab Stu or Amanda afterwards to dive into the detail. And it's a real pleasure for me now, as a surprise to Stu, only last night, to award him with the SEBP prize for 2024 for outstanding applied research that is genuinely transformational. There's a lot going on in Stu's life at the moment. He was still able to make it here today, and as you can see, I think that will change the approach that policing takes in the UK and probably abroad for a very long period of time, because of the detail and focus that he gave, and he deserves the credit for it. Dorset, no doubt, are really proud of what Stu has done. So, Stu, on behalf of the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, congratulations, and I'd like to present this to you. Just take a little photo.